Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The old Jewish story goes that Yankel and Mendel are walking down the street. They're extremely hungry. They're destitute. They're Jewish peasants. And there's a sign outside the church that says, "Conversions to Christianity, we pay $1,000. Yankel says, "Mendel, go in and we'll split it." Mendel says, "No, Yankel, you go in." So Mendel agrees, "Okay, I'll go in." Walks into the church, comes out a half hour later, and he's a transformed man. The payas are cut, the yarmulke's gone. In the middle is one of those bald, Dominican kind of bald spots. And Yankel says to Mendel, Mendel, did you get the money?" And Mendel looks at Yankel and says, "All you Jews think about is money." That, ladies and gentlemen, is unfortunately a very apt metaphor for what happened to a Jew named Jesus approximately 2,000 years ago. Because although we are here to debate who indeed was responsible for the murder of the historical Jesus, although we are here to clarify and ascertain who it was that ordered and carried out his death, in many ways, that question is less relevant than an even greater point. Because although, as I shall prove, it was the Romans and solely the Romans who put Jesus to death, it was the Christians who crucified Christ. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, my dear brothers and sisters, my Christian brothers and sisters, of course not all, but too many, nailed Jesus to a cross of hatred. They nailed him to the rancid wood of racism and bigotry. They took a man who was called the Prince of Peace and put a white hood on him. They took a man who so loved his people that he said in Matthew chapter 10 to the 12 apostles, "Go nowhere among the Gentiles, enter no town of the Samaritans, go only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." They took that man and they put a swastika on his arm. And they made him the very fountain of anti-Semitism. If there was ever a greater act of character assassination in the history of the world, then I don't know it. And if Jesus were alive today, to look upon the rivers of blood, oceans of blood that have been spilt, his people's blood in his name, he would not want to live, and we wouldn't have to debate who killed him because he would kill himself without absolving anyone's sin, because no one can absolve that sin, because all the blood on earth will not bring back 1.5 million Jewish children of the Holocaust, and all the blood on earth will not bring back thousands of pogroms and inquisitions and crusades. My people have been slaughtered in the name of one of our own. How ironic. Is this the Prince of Peace? The one who tells us in John 8:44 that Jews are the devil? Or in John 8:19 that Jews have no knowledge of God the Father? Or who tells us in John 8:21 that Jews are all destined to die in their sins? Is this the loving Jesus that my colleague Mike Brown has just told us about? One of the great New Testament scholars, Dagobert Runis, wrote, "The New Testament contains 102 references to the Jews of the most degrading and malevolent kind, thereby creating in the minds and hearts of the Christian children and adults ineradicable hatred toward the Jewish people." Mike said that the New Testament does not say that we killed Jesus once explicitly. It says so several times explicitly, beginning with Peter, the first pope, choice of the apostles. Acts chapter 2, verse 36, "Therefore let the entire house of Israel know with certainty that God has made him both Lord and Messiah, this Jesus whom you crucified." He is talking to the Jews. He is in a council of Jews. Acts chapter 3, verse 13, Peter speaking again, "But you Jews rejected the holy and righteous one, and asked to have a murderer, Barabbas, given to you, and you killed," quote, "the author of life," it is capitalized, "whom God raised from the dead." Third place in the New Testament where it says the Jews killed Jesus. Peter speaking again, Acts chapter 5, verse 30. Peter tells members of the Jewish council, quote, "The God of our ancestors raised up Jesus, whom you had killed by hanging him on a tree." Whom you, not the Romans, had killed by hanging him on a tree. Should we believe Peter? Peter, ladies and gentlemen, is a confirmed liar. And if you say that I am anti-Christian for saying so, it was Jesus who said so. You know, we all know the story. In all 4 of the Gospels, Peter, you will deny me 3 times before the cock crows. A confirmed liar says, according to who Christians see as God, Jesus called him a liar. And he's the one that says that we killed God. What about Paul, who says the same accusation? In 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 15. The Jews who killed both the Lord Jesus and the prophets and drove us out, they displease God and they oppose everyone. Should we believe Paul? Well, Paul is a self-confessed liar. He says in Romans chapter 3, verse 7, "If through my lies God's truth abounds to his glory, why am I still being condemned as a sinner?" Finally, ladies and gentlemen, Jesus himself seems to predict that he will be killed by the Jews. Matthew chapter 23, verse 33, "You serpents, you brood of vipers, how are you to escape being sentenced to hell? Therefore I send you prophets and wise men and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify." Crucify can only mean Jesus. The Jews never crucified anyone. It was a Roman death. "And some you will scourge in the synagogues, that upon you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth." Sure sounds like Matthew chapter 27 to me, where the Jews invited the curse of Jesus' blood upon them. From the blood of innocent Abel, the Jews are even responsible for the blood of Abel, to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. This is Jesus speaking. I believe Jesus was a great scholar, so he couldn't have made this mistake, because the actual person who was put to death was Zechariah ben Yehoiada, who lived 324 years later. Clearly, then, the verse is a forgery. The point is, ladies and gentlemen, Jews and Christians today have entered into a totally new era. Gone are the pogroms and the blood libels of yesteryear. Gone are the cries of Christ killer. Gone are Jewish children going to American public schools and being made to cry at passion plays because they're always asked to play Judas. I don't look Jewish, so they never asked me. They always said to me, "You look Swedish. You play Jesus." Because he always has to have blonde hair and blue eyes. Ladies and gentlemen, the Christians are arguably the best friends the Jews have in the United States today. We in the Jewish community are not just grateful to Christians in general and evangelical Christians like Mike Brown, my colleague in particular, for their support of Israel. We understand that it is their devout faith inspired by Jesus that makes them so supportive of Israel against Islamic suicide bombs. But what is this film all about, and why are people getting behind it? Isn't this the past? Isn't the day of Jews being portrayed in a Hollywood movie as calling for Jesus' death, taking sadistic delight in the pain and torture of a man whom Christians regard as God? Isn't that old hat? Must we really never be able to move on? I ask you, can the human mind even conjure up a more heinous allegation? Not that someone is a mass murderer like Hitler, having killed millions of humanity, but that a nation snuffed out the source of life itself. Is there a more heinous allegation that the human mind can conjure up? That one nation blocked out the rays of the sun. Only one people have ever been accused of it, it's the Jews. And only one nation has ever made the accusation. It's the Christians. And I am appealing to my honest Christian brethren, wherever they may be, oppose this film, because it is an act of glaring defamation, and it is a lie. What are the facts about Jesus' death? Tacitus, most important Roman historian of his time, says clearly, quote, "Christus, the founder of the name, had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate." Period. Josephus, we're not even sure if this is authentic, but even if it is, Josephus says, when Pilate, upon hearing Jesus accused by men of the highest standing amongst us, the Jewish high priest, who was an agent of Rome, he was essentially the Roman enforcer. The rabbis, the Pharisees, hated the high priests, and as soon as the Roman war broke out in 66, they got rid of the Roman high priest, the Jewish high priest who was appointed by Rome. But he says clearly, Pilate had him condemned to be crucified, period. This was par for the course. Jesus wasn't the only one. They put to death every would-be Messiah. Judah of Galilee was put to death by the Romans in 6 CE. Theodos was put to death in 44 CE. There was no trial. They cut his head off, and they threw it into the Jordan River, which he tried to part. Benjamin the Egyptian was put to death in 60 CE. Pontius Pilate, according to every modern and ancient historian, was the cruelest proconsul the Romans ever put into Judea. Mel Gibson's film, based on Matthew 27, is absolutely scandalous. It is defamatory. The idea that Pontius Pilate, a man described by King Agrippa as, quote, and this is in a letter to the Emperor Caligula, a man who harbors acts of violence, plunderings, abuses, provocations, corruption, continual murders of persons untried, uncondemned, never-ending, endless, unbelievable cruelties, gratuitous and most grievous inhumanity, end quote. Philo, one of the most important figures of the entire ancient world, speaking about Pilate. Pilate was, quote, an unbending and recklessly hard character, famous for corruptibility, violence, robberies, ill treatment of the people, grievances, continued execution without any form of trial, endless and intolerable cruelties. Does this sound like a man whom, according to Newsweek, because I have not seen the film, Mel hasn't invited the rabbis to see it. There's been a screening at like every church in America, but not one in a synagogue. I mean, why should he show it to the Jews? I mean, just because this has been the most heinous allegation that has slaughtered them through the ages. I mean, who's asking for just a drop of sensitivity in the third Christian millennium in America? By the way, I don't expect a lot from Mel. He said today to an Australian newspaper that his wife is going to hell. Do you know that? He said that she's very loving, she's a better person than him, but because she's a Protestant, she is going to hell. Which means that my dear friend Mike Brown, and we really are becoming closer as time goes on, believe it or not, and he very lovingly told me in our last debate that although he really cares for me, you know, I am going to hell because I don't believe in Jesus. Okay, I mean, you know, I'll find out when I get there, and I grew up in Miami, and I'm used to heat, and maybe this is going to, you know, maybe this will really be hot, But according to Mel Gibson, my dear friend Mike Brown, along with Mel Gibson's wife, is going straight to hell. What happened to the good old days when he used to run around with that black actor, Danny Glover? It warmed all our hearts, a black man and a white man walking around shooting people together. You remember that? The good old days? Before he became just a rancid, anti-Semitic bigot? If you don't believe me about the nature of Pontius Pilate, read Luke in the New Testament, chapter 13, verse 1, where it is related how Pilate murdered and massacred huge groups of Galileans who were worshiping in the temple. And of course, Jesus was a Galilean. Read Josephus, who says that Pilate was so cruel that he had to be recalled by Rome in the year 36 because a Samaritan prophet had gained a large following and brought them up to a holy mountain, and Pilate slaughtered all 4,000 of them. Could you imagine how cruel you have to be for the Romans to consider you cruel? But this is the man who Newsweek tells me Mel portrays as contemplative, meditative. His wife has dreams about Jesus. She says he's a holy man. I mean, this man was Saddam Hussein. He was the Saddam Hussein of the ancient world. What mercy? What are we talking about here? Where's the history? As far as this belief that the Jews wanted to kill Christ, give me a break. The New Testament says clearly that the Jews several times saved the life of Jesus. Luke chapter 13, verse 31. At that very hour, some Pharisees came and said to Jesus, "Get away from here. Herod wants to kill you." And you know why the Jews would save Jesus? Because he wasn't a bad man. Because he was a devout Jew. Because all he wanted to do was reinforce Jewish observance of the Torah, as he says in Matthew chapter 5, verse 18, that anyone who doesn't keep the Torah will be the least in the kingdom of heaven. All Jesus wanted was to throw off the Roman oppression of his beloved people. So he declared himself the Messiah, which there's no problem declaring yourself the Messiah. My mother's convinced it's me. And all you have to do is fulfill the messianic prophecies. He tried. I think it's time for us Jews to take back Jesus from the anti-Semitic Jesus that he was been made into by our Christian brethren. What a tragedy. He was one of ours. We should take him back. He should be seen for what he was, a learned rabbi who so loved Jewish people and so hated their oppression that he was prepared to fight the Romans And he was almost, there's even a few verses in the New Testament that he asked his disciples to get swords. He was even prepared for a military conflict in order to throw off their oppression. And he was killed. He was a martyr for his cause. Let's go further. Gamaliel was the leader of the whole Pharisaic party. He's considered one of the greatest rabbis of all time. When the Apostle Peter was being tried and they wanted to put him to death, it was Gamaliel who saved his life in Acts chapter 5, verse 16, 17, and 18. In Acts 5:33, in Acts 5:33, it was Gamaliel who saves Peter. And later, it's the Pharisees who even saved Paul, even though Paul spews such venom at the Pharisees constantly. According to Acts 23, verses 6 through 9, quote, "Then a great clamor arose, and some of the scribes of the Pharisees' party stood up, and they said, 'We find nothing wrong in this man. What if a spirit or an angel spoke to him?'" Pharisees saved Jesus' life. Gamaliel saves Peter's life. The Pharisees save Paul's life. Doesn't it sound to you like they had no real problem with the Christian sect and it was really the Romans? Doesn't it make sense to say that since all these Gospels are written after the year 66, when the terrible war between the Jews and the Romans broke out, and some of them were even written after 100 CE, doesn't it make sense to say that the Christians decided to re-edit all of their Holy Scripture to ensure that the Romans would be exonerated and that the Jews would be implicated in the death of Jesus? I mean, doesn't it make perfect sense to say, even if the Romans, let alone trying to court Roman power, even if the Christians wanted to proselytize, you knock on a Christian's door, this isn't my argument, I saw it on the internet, you knock on a Christian's door and you say, "Hey, I'm a Christian." I'm sorry, you knock on a Roman's door, "I'm a Christian. We have this church at the edge of Rome by the catacombs. Come for Sunday services." And the Roman says, "But what is Christianity?" And he says, "Oh, it's named after a man who was put to death as a common criminal by one of your governors." Could you see the Roman saying, "Yeah, can I bring the kids?" I mean, obviously the Roman would just slam the door in his face. Therefore, it had to say something different. What is Christianity? Simple. This was a great rabbi who really was God, but the Jews, who all of us hate, are so devilish, so demonic, they couldn't tolerate him, so they put him to death. Don't you see the rabbis had no problem with Jesus? What are the main things that the New Testament says that the rabbis, their arguments against Jesus? They said that he healed on Shabbos. Every Orthodox doctor on earth heals on Shabbos. If a rabbi doesn't tell someone to be healed on Shabbos when their life is threatened, they would probably be thrown out of their synagogue and they would never get a job again. Number two, they said that Jesus predicted the end of the temple. Everyone knew the second temple wasn't going to stand forever. It was missing 10 of the most important ingredients of the first temple. The Pharisees hated those who controlled the temple. They were the Sadducees party who were Roman agents. As far as Jesus saying, "You have heard on the Sermon on the Mount that eye for an eye, but I'm here to tell you differently," Jesus was a Pharisee. Of course, it doesn't mean an eye for an eye. He studied what later was written down as the Talmud. We have never understood that verse literally. He was a Pharisaic rabbi in every respect. And that's why when his students pick ears of corn, he defends himself by saying David did the same thing when David's life was threatened when he was being chased by Saul. It was a life-threatening situation. Ladies and gentlemen, the passion of Christ in the New Testament simply has too many discrepancies for it not to be fundamentally reevaluated. According to the Synoptic Gospels of Mark, Luke, and Matthew, the Last Supper takes place at the Seder on Passover Eve. According to John, it takes place the night before. And who would believe in any way that the trial that was supposed to take place that night, can anyone imagine the Sanhedrin? The Sanhedrin meeting on the night of Passover? You go to find a Jewish home in America where they don't have a Seder on Passover Eve. Can someone imagine the Supreme Court of the United States meeting to try and execute someone on Christmas Eve when his offense was only, diagnosed hours earlier? This is impossible. And there's so many other discrepancies. According to the four Gospels, there's four different things that Jesus said on three different things. He said on the cross. He either said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" I hope he didn't say that because that sounds like blasphemy, and I bet he did not. That was just in order to fulfill the prophecy of Psalms 22. According to another gospel, he said, "It is done." That's in John. And according to Luke, he said, Mike might have to help me here. He said, he said it's finished. That's in John. And in Luke, he says, "Father, forgive them. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they have done." And I don't know what I'm talking about. Okay, so that was a joke. I really do know what I'm talking about. The discrepancies are just too great. And the same thing is true even with the trials themselves. In John, we have 1.5 trials. In Luke, we have 3 trials, where even Herod Antipas is trying Jesus. In the Gospel of Peter, which was not even included in the biblical canon, you have the Jews who actually crucified Jesus literally. Now I ask you, with all these discrepancies, whether we must not fundamentally evaluate these verses. Because the stakes here are not just about whether the Jews killed Jesus. The stakes are whether a great first century rabbi will be remembered for what he was, a man who loved his people and a man of peace. Thank you.